The hidden valley did not appear on any county map. Men rode past the ridge for years without knowing that a wooden door stood locked inside the limestone, hidden behind vines and weathered stone. Yet on a cold March morning in 1880, a 16-year-old girl was traveling toward that forgotten place, with nothing except a worn canvas suitcase and a rusted brass key resting tightly inside her hand. The driver kept his eyes on the muddy trail. The old mare climbed one slippery bend after another, blowing white clouds into the cold air. The girl never looked away from the mountain ahead. She had never owned land. She had never owned a home. She had never even owned tomorrow. Yet someone she had never met had left her an entire mountain. If stories like this remind you how one decision can change a life forever, stay with us until the end. This journey begins where almost everyone else would have turned back. 3 days earlier, the morning inside St. Catherine's orphan home had begun like every other morning. The bell rang before sunrise. Cold water splashed into metal wash basins. Girls hurried into faded gray dresses while the smell of thin oatmeal drifted through the brick building. Nobody expected anything different. Least of all, Mena Ashcroft. She moved quietly through the crowded room, folding her blanket with careful hands before helping a younger girl tie the buttons on her dress. She had learned long ago that asking for kindness usually ended in disappointment. So she offered it whenever she could. The headmistress entered carrying a single envelope. Miss Agatha Krull rarely smiled. Her shoes struck the wooden floor with slow, measured steps. Every whisper disappeared before she spoke. She adjusted her spectacles and unfolded the letter. Wilhelmina Ashcroft. The room turned. Nobody ever used Mena's full name. She stood. The envelope remained in the woman's hands for another long second before she began reading. A notice has arrived from Attorney Samuel Whitlock of Hazard, Kentucky. The girls exchanged confused looks. Kentucky might as well have been another country. The headmistress continued. A deceased relative has named Miss Wilhelmina Ashcroft as sole heir to 12 acres of mountain land, a small cabin, several farming tools, one sealed journal, and a secured limestone chamber. Silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then laughter burst across the room. One girl covered her mouth. Another shook her head. A cave. Someone inherited a hole. I'd rather have nothing. The laughter spread from bed to bed. Mena remained standing. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her breathing slowed instead of quickening. She had lived through too many disappointments to react before knowing the truth. Miss Krull folded the letter with sharp, exact movements. She stepped closer. A mountain cannot feed a child. Her voice stayed flat. A cave cannot raise a future. She placed the envelope into Mena's hand. If you choose to go, do not expect anyone here to rescue you. Mena lowered her eyes to the faded paper. Her fingers tightened around its edge. No one had ever written her name because they wanted her. No one had ever searched for her. Yet somewhere in Kentucky, someone had remembered. That thought stayed with her through breakfast. It stayed while the other girls whispered. It stayed while she packed the few things she owned into a canvas suitcase already worn through at one corner. Inside went 2 dresses. One wool shawl. A family photograph so faded that faces had almost disappeared. A silver thimble that had belonged to her mother. And 3 books she had hidden beneath loose floorboards after the headmistress burned the rest. They were books about soil, rain, seeds. She had read them so often that entire pages lived inside her memory. When she carried the suitcase downstairs, the front door already stood open. Cold wind slipped through the hallway. Miss Krull waited beside the entrance. Neither woman spoke. The wagon driver loaded the suitcase. Before Mena climbed aboard, the older woman finally broke the silence. Whatever waits inside that mountain, she paused. Leave it there. Mena looked at her for only a second. Then she climbed into the wagon without answering. The orphanage disappeared behind the falling mist. For the first time since she was 9 years old, no bell would wake her tomorrow. The journey lasted nearly 4 days. Railroads carried her only part of the way. After that came crowded coaches, mud roads, narrow mountain trails, Each mile carried her farther from every place she had ever known. The land slowly changed. Flat fields disappeared. Tall forests covered the hills. Creeks flashed beneath wooden bridges. Mist drifted between the ridges even after sunrise. Everything felt older, as though the mountains had been waiting much longer than people. At the edge of hazard, an older attorney greeted her with a respectful nod. Samuel Whitlock looked more like a farmer than a lawyer. His coat had been repaired many times. His boots carried fresh mud, yet his handshake was steady. "You've traveled far." Mena nodded. "I have something that belongs to you." He reached beneath the seat of his wagon and lifted a small cloth bundle. Inside rested a heavy brass key. Time had darkened the metal. Rust clung around its teeth. The handle had been shaped like the curled leaf of an oak tree. 4 words had been carved by hand. "When light cannot follow." Mena traced the letters with one finger. "Your great-aunt insisted this remain sealed until you reach the mountain." He handed her a second package. It was a thick leather journal tied with faded cord. The cover carried only one line. "Field notes. Eleanor Ashcroft." Nothing more. Samuel watched her quietly. "The people around Iron Ridge Hollow thought your aunt lived alone. They called her strange. They laughed at her." He looked toward the distant mountains. "But strange people sometimes leave behind the most useful things." Neither spoke again. Hours later, the trail narrowed until the wagon could barely pass between 2 cliffs. The mare slowed. Samuel pointed ahead. There, far below, hidden between 3 towering ridges, a narrow valley opened beneath the afternoon light. An old cabin rested beside a winding creek. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. Behind the cabin, built directly into the face of the limestone mountain, stood a heavy wooden door wrapped in iron bands. Even from this distance, Mena could see the rusted lock waiting at its center. The brass key inside her pocket suddenly felt much heavier. Without realizing it, her hand closed tightly around it. Because somewhere behind that forgotten door, someone had spent 40 years preparing something. Not for the town, not for the world, for her. The wagon rolled slowly down the final slope. Loose stones cracked beneath the wheels. Cold water rushed beside the narrow trail, carrying melted snow toward the valley floor. Mena watched every detail without speaking. Nothing about Iron Ridge Hollow looked abandoned. It looked as though someone had stepped away only yesterday. The cabin stood beneath a row of towering pines. Its roof sagged under years of weather. One shutter hung loose. The chimney leaned slightly toward the creek. Yet the yard remained strangely clean. No weeds had swallowed the stone path. No fallen branches covered the entrance. It felt less like an empty home, and more like a place waiting for its owner to return. Samuel Whitlock stopped the wagon beside the porch. He climbed down first and helped Mena with her suitcase. The valley was silent except for the creek and the wind brushing through the pines. No birds sang. No dogs barked. Even the air seemed to pause. Samuel carried the leather journal onto the porch. "This belongs here." He placed it carefully beside the front door. Then he looked toward the mountain. The cave entrance is behind the cabin. Mena followed his eyes. Half hidden beneath ivy and gray limestone stood the heavy wooden door she had seen from the ridge. Iron bands crossed its surface. The rusted padlock remained untouched. It looked older than the cabin itself, older than the road, almost older than the mountain. Samuel reached into his coat and handed her several folded papers. "Your aunt arranged everything years before she passed. You own the land. My office will handle the legal papers until you turn 18. He smiled faintly. "But no one will tell you how to live." Those words settled inside Mena more deeply than he could have known. For 7 years, someone else had decided every hour of her life. When to wake, when to eat, when to speak. Now, no one would. Samuel climbed back into the wagon. "If you ever need help, my office door stays open." Mena thanked him quietly. The old mare turned. The wagon disappeared around the trees. The sound of wheels faded. Then even that was gone. For the first time in her life, complete silence belonged to her. She carried her suitcase inside the cabin. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon light. The floor creaked beneath every step. One chair had lost a leg. The iron stove was cracked along one side. Rain had stained part of the ceiling. Yet nothing felt ruined beyond repair. It felt unfinished, as if someone expected another pair of hands to continue the work. She unpacked slowly. The photograph rested beside the window. Her mother's silver thimble went into a small wooden drawer. The books were stacked carefully near the table. Finally, she placed the leather journal in front of her. The cover showed years of use. Its corners had softened. The leather smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. She untied the strap. The first page held only one sentence. "If these pages have reached you, then the mountain has accepted you." Mena stared at the handwriting. Every letter had been written with patience. No hurried strokes, no wasted ink. She turned another page. Instead of stories, she found sketches. Stone walls, water channels, mirror angles, garden beds, notes about underground temperatures, seasonal sunlight, moisture inside limestone. Everything had been measured. Everything had been tested. Her great-aunt had not simply lived here. She had studied this mountain for decades. A folded paper slipped from between the pages. Mena opened it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map. One line circled the wooden door behind the cabin. Another pointed toward a narrow passage farther inside. Two locations remained crossed out with thick black ink. Below them appeared only 3 words. "Not yet. Wait." Mena looked toward the window. The mountain stood motionless. Whatever those hidden places contained, her aunt had believed they required time. She closed the journal. The sun had already begun sliding behind the western ridge. There would be time tomorrow. That evening tested her immediately. The cracked stove refused to hold heat. Smoke drifted back into the room. Cold wind slipped through gaps beside the window frame. She gathered fallen branches until darkness covered the valley. By nightfall, the fire barely stayed alive. She wrapped herself inside 2 blankets and listened. Water outside, wind above, timbers settling. Then, another sound. A slow metallic knock. Not at the cabin door. Outside, toward the mountain. She sat upright. The sound came again. Clang. Long, hollow, like iron touching old iron. Lantern in one hand. She stepped onto the porch. Moonlight covered the valley with silver light. Nothing moved. She crossed the yard carefully. Each breath formed white clouds. The wooden mountain door stood exactly where it had before. The rusted padlock still hung in place. No footprints surrounded it. No branches had fallen. She reached forward. The cold iron pressed against her fingers. The lock never moved. Yet she could have sworn. Something had struck it from the inside. She stepped backward. The valley became silent again. Only the creek continued flowing through the darkness. Mena looked down at the brass key resting in her palm. It felt strangely warm despite the freezing air. She remembered the words written inside the journal. "If these pages have reached you, then the mountain has accepted you." Accepted, not invited, not welcomed. Accepted. Those were different things. She slipped the key back into her pocket. Tonight was not the night. She returned to the cabin. Sleep came only in short moments, before sunrise. She was already awake. Thin morning light slipped through the window. She opened the journal once more. The next page contained only a single instruction written across the center. "Before you open the mountain, learn why it was sealed." The first rays of morning slipped over the eastern ridge and touched the cabin roof. Mena stood outside with the journal tucked beneath one arm. The mountain looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more patient. She crossed the damp grass toward the wooden door. The brass key rested in her hand. For a long moment, she simply listened. Water trickled somewhere inside the limestone. A cool breeze drifted through the pine trees. Nothing else. She slid the key into the rusted lock. It resisted at first. Years of weather held it tight. She pressed harder. The iron groaned. Then the lock released with a sharp click that echoed through the valley. Mena pulled the heavy door open. Cool air flowed out across her face. It smelled of stone, fresh water, and earth after rain. She lifted her lantern. The passage stretched gently downward. Its walls had been shaped by nature, yet someone had widened parts of the floor with careful hands. Small stone markers lined the path. Every few yards, another lantern hook had been fastened into the rock. Someone had planned every step. She followed the passage slowly. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a chamber far larger than she imagined. She stopped walking. Rows of stone garden beds filled the room. Wooden channels carried crystal-clear water from the cave wall. Above her, dozens of polished mirrors hung beneath the ceiling. Each one reflected sunlight down through a narrow crack high above the mountain. Soft, natural light reached every corner. Not bright, but enough. The entire room glowed with quiet daylight. Mena slowly lowered her lantern. She no longer needed it. Her eyes moved from one bed to another. Most stood empty after winter, yet tiny green leaves already pushed through several rows. Life had survived underground. She knelt beside one bed. The soil felt warm, not hot, simply alive. She opened the journal. The matching page appeared immediately. The mountain never freezes. Protect the soil, and the soil will protect you. Another drawing showed the mirror system. Each mirror carried a number. Each season required a different angle. Mena looked upward again. Her great-aunt had turned sunlight into a tool. She had built an underground farm without machines, without electricity, without help, only patience, and years of work. Hours passed without Mena noticing. She cleaned the water channels, removed fallen leaves, straightened loose stones around the beds. The work felt strangely familiar, almost as if someone beside her silently showed each movement. By afternoon, she climbed back outside. The valley suddenly seemed much smaller. The mountain held more life than everything above it. That evening, she carried a bucket toward the creek. Halfway there, she heard voices. 2 men stood near the old fence at the edge of the property. Both wore worn hunting coats. Neither crossed onto her land. Instead, they stared toward the cave. One finally noticed her. "So, you're the orphan." Mena nodded once. The older man removed his hat. "I'm Ezra Collins. This is my brother, Ben. We farm the next valley." Neither smiled. Neither looked unfriendly, only cautious. Ezra glanced toward the mountain door. "Folks say you're living where the old mountain woman lived." "My aunt." Ezra nodded slowly. "She never bothered anybody. But people talked. They always do." Ben shifted his weight. "We heard smoke from the chimney again. Figured we'd see who came." Mena thanked them for stopping. The conversation remained short. Before leaving, Ezra looked back once more. "If anyone from Mill Creek gives you trouble, you send word." Then both brothers disappeared down the trail. Mena watched until they vanished among the trees. Not everyone believed rumors. That mattered. The next morning, she began planting. Lettuce first, exactly as the journal instructed. Then spinach. Then radishes along the cooler beds farther inside. Every seed disappeared beneath soft cave soil. Water flowed gently through narrow channels. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing wasted. Near midday, she noticed something unusual. The mirrors no longer reflected sunlight exactly where they had that morning. The light slowly shifted across the room, moving from one bed toward another. She climbed onto a stone ledge. The mirror frames had tiny wooden hinges. As the sunlight changed, balanced weights quietly adjusted the angle by themselves. Her great-aunt had designed a moving system, without gears, without springs. Only gravity, only careful balance. Mena laughed softly to herself. For the first time since leaving the orphanage, She wasn't surviving. She was learning. Days turned into weeks. The cabin slowly improved. She repaired the broken window, patched holes in the roof, stacked fresh firewood beside the porch. Every evening ended inside the mountain garden. Every morning began there again. The work filled the silence, but one question never left her. Why had her great-aunt hidden all this? If this place could grow food year-round, why had nobody known? Late one afternoon, while cleaning the back wall of the first chamber, her hand struck something solid behind loose stones. Not natural rock. Wood. She brushed away decades of dust. A small cedar cabinet appeared inside the wall. It had no lock, only a carved message across its front. When the first harvest feeds another soul, then open what waits beyond. Mena rested her hand against the cabinet. She did not force it open. Instead, she stepped back, because she finally understood. The mountain was not testing her strength. It was testing her heart. And somewhere beyond that hidden cabinet, another secret had been waiting for more than 40 years. The first harvest came sooner than Mena expected. Spring rain covered the valley for 3 straight days. Outside, the fields turned to thick mud. Inside the mountain, nothing changed. The stone walls held the same steady coolness. The mirrors gathered every thin strip of sunlight that slipped through the hidden shaft above. The lettuce grew thicker. The spinach spread across the beds. Tiny radishes pushed against the dark soil. On the first morning of May, Mena carried a woven basket into the cave. She knelt beside the nearest bed. Her fingers closed gently around the first full head of lettuce. The leaves were crisp, bright, without a single insect bite. She smiled without realizing it. For 7 years, she had waited in long food lines. Now food had grown because of her own hands. She filled only half the basket. The journal had warned her never to harvest everything. The soil gives tomorrow only if you leave something for tomorrow. She whispered the words as though her great-aunt stood beside her. That afternoon she walked 7 miles into Mill Creek. The basket rested against her hip. People stopped talking when she stepped onto the wooden bridge. Several children stared. 2 older men looked away. Mrs. Evelyn Parker stood outside the general store holding the hand of a small boy whose cheeks had become pale after a long winter. The child kept coughing. His mother searched inside her apron for coins. "I only have 3 cents. Mena looked at the basket. She lifted out 2 heads of lettuce, a bundle of spinach, 4 radishes. She placed them gently into the woman's hands. "You'll need these more than I do." Mrs. Parker froze. "I can't pay for all this." "You already did." The woman looked confused. "You reminded me why this place exists." Mena smiled softly. "Grow strong. Nothing more." She turned and started walking home. She never noticed the people watching from the porch of the store. She never heard the quiet conversations beginning behind her. By sunset, the mountain had already started changing lives. The following morning, Mena stood once again before the hidden cedar cabinet inside the cave. She rested both hands against the wooden doors. Her first harvest had fed someone else. The condition had been fulfilled. Slowly, she pulled the doors open. Inside rested dozens of cloth packets, carefully arranged upon cedar shelves. Each carried handwritten labels: mountain beans, winter cabbage, blue corn, medicinal herbs, apple rootstock wrapped in damp moss, wild strawberry runners, seed varieties from nearly every corner of America. Beneath them lay another leather notebook, smaller than the first. Its cover carried only one sentence: "A farm survives because knowledge survives." Inside, every page listed names: families, widows, orphans, travelers. Beside each name appeared notes: who had received seeds, who had returned stronger harvests, who had shared with neighbors. Her great-aunt had quietly built a network of mountain families for decades, not through money. Through seeds, through trust. On the final page rested another folded letter. Mena unfolded it carefully. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then you have already done the one thing I prayed for. You shared before you stored. That means this mountain belongs to the right hands. Never measure a farm by how much it keeps. Measure it by how many empty tables become full because it exists. If people someday laugh at you, keep planting. If they doubt you, keep planting. One season always answers louder than an argument. And when another lonely child someday arrives carrying nothing except hope, give them the key. Mena folded the letter against her chest. She stood quietly beneath the mirrors while reflected sunlight drifted across the cave walls. No tears came, only steady breathing. Outside, the valley entered summer. Weeks became months. The greenhouse beside the mountain door filled with tomatoes. Peppers climbed their frames. Beans reached toward the glass roof. The underground beds continued producing greens even during the hottest days. Soon people crossed the bridge every Saturday. Not to stare, to buy vegetables, to ask questions, to learn. Ezra Collins returned carrying lumber for a stronger greenhouse. Mrs. Parker brought homemade bread. The school teacher asked whether children could visit the cave to study plants. Even the blacksmith offered new iron hinges for the mountain door. The valley slowly forgot the stories about witches. They began telling different stories instead. Stories about the young woman who could grow food when drought ruined everyone else's gardens. Stories about the quiet farm inside the mountain. Stories people once refused to believe until they saw it with their own eyes. Years passed. The abandoned cabin became a sturdy stone farmhouse. Stone terraces covered the hillside. Apple trees lined the creek. The hidden valley no longer waited in silence. It breathed with life. One autumn afternoon, long after Mena had become known throughout the Cumberland Mountains, a wagon climbed the same muddy road she had traveled as a frightened 16-year-old. A little girl stepped down. Her clothes were patched. She carried one worn suitcase. Nothing else. She stood nervously beside the gate. I was told, "Someone here helps children with nowhere to go." Mena looked at the child for a long moment. Without speaking, she reached into her apron pocket. The old brass key rested there. Its rust had been polished away by years of careful hands. She placed it gently into the girl's palm. Then she smiled. "Come. I've been waiting for you." Far behind them, the mountain stood exactly as it always had. Patient, silent, keeping one family's promise alive for another generation. And somewhere beneath the limestone, fresh seeds were already waiting for the next pair of hopeful hands.